Hello and welcome to the next lecture for my class, Psychological Aspects of Drug Use and Abuse. This is going to be the first in, I think, probably a three-part series where I'll look at the effects that drugs have in the peripheral and central nervous system, and I'll try and consider it from this issue from a couple of different perspectives. The reason for doing this at this point in the semester is to give those of you in my class or people who are just watching these videos on YouTube, if there are so many people, to give you all a bit of a basis or a kind of a foundation that will be useful when we consider specific drugs later on in future lectures. So again, this is basic, rather introductory material. If you've had a good biology class, especially a good neurobiology class, some of this will be review for you, but I think it's an interesting review and hopefully it's something you'll enjoy checking in with, as I do every time I give this lecture and the next lectures in the series. For the purposes of today's lecture, I'm just going to focus on the peripheral nervous system. I'm going to basically introduce what the peripheral nervous system is, how it's distinct, at least in terms of our organizational system, from the central nervous system, and I'll talk a little bit about basic effects that drugs have in the peripheral nervous system. So okay, let's begin with this introduction. Let's introduce the nervous system, which is a challenging thing to set out to do because, as many biology textbooks are fond of pointing out, the nervous system, especially the central nervous system and especially the brain within the central nervous system, is arguably the most complicated thing in the universe, or at least the most complicated thing that humans have found. Trying to explain how it is that all the things you are and feel and think and imagine about the world around you and perceive, all of that is in some way tied up in the structure and the function of this rather interesting system of connected nervous tissue in your body and in your head. Is really fascinating, and you could obviously spend a whole lifetime studying the nervous system or even how the nervous system is influenced by drugs. We're just going to do some basic introduction here, and we're going to begin by making its distinction between the central nervous system, which are basically all the nerves and tissue of the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system. These are all the nerves that branch out from the central nervous system. And like I said already, today in this little lecture I'm going to focus on the peripheral nervous system. This is just another picture similar to the one on the previous slide that's designed to give you a sense of obviously the location of the brain and the spinal cord, and also the peripheral nerves which branch out from the spinal cord to different parts of the body. Now, having broken down the nervous system into two parts, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, we're going to further subdivide or break apart the peripheral nervous system into the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. Now, I'll get to that in a second. But the somatic nervous system is all the parts of the peripheral nervous system which transmit signals from the sense organs up into the central nervous system and transmit signals from the central nervous system out to the skeletal muscles, which are the parts of your muscular system which allow you to engage in voluntary activity or movement, mostly. So if you've taken a good anatomy or physiology class, or you've taken a good biology class, you may have seen the kind of classic example of how this might work. A person is boiling a kettle of water on the stove, they accidentally touch the stove and they withdraw their hand from the heat, maybe saying ouch or swearing as they do this. In that scenario, temperature receptors in the hand respond to the presence of heat. They transmit that signal up through the peripheral nervous system or the somatic portion of the peripheral nervous system to the spinal cord, and depending on the nature of the pain sensation, even higher into the brain. The brain and the spinal cord develop a response using the motor neurons, which pass that signal out through the somatic branch of the autonomic nervous system to the muscles in the hand and the arm, and the hand jerks backwards, and again maybe the person curses or swears. That's an example of how the somatic nervous system can work to help you detect things in the world around you that are important and respond in mostly in voluntary ways with regards to that, or in response to those stimuli in the environment. So that's the somatic portion, or sometimes called the somatic branch of the peripheral nervous system. The other portion or branch of the peripheral nervous system, and the one that we're really going to focus a lot on in this class, is the autonomic nervous system. And this is the part of the peripheral nervous system that transmits signals from the central nervous system out to the smooth muscles, to the organs, and to the glands of the body. Now, again, skeletal muscles, I mentioned earlier, are all the different types of muscles in your musculature system, which engage in mostly voluntary movement. So as you reach for a cup of coffee, you walk across the room, you talk to your friends, all those muscles are usually grouped together in these skeletal muscles because they move, among other things, the skeleton of your body and allow you to get stuff done that you want to get done in the world. The smooth muscles in your body are muscles which for the most part you don't have a lot of voluntary control over. So if you eat something or swallow a sip of coffee, the muscles which move that food or that fluid through your digestive system are called smooth muscles, and you don't really have to think about the peristaltic action that moves food through your gut. It just happens on its own. There are other muscles around your body which similarly work more or less on their own. You don't voluntarily control them. Your cardiac muscles, in your heart are similar, although they're often grouped differently just because the heart's so important. But the important idea here is that the smooth muscles are mostly the parts of the muscular system that you don't have much control over. Similarly, your organs are, of course, the different organs that your body has, and which you do different things, like your stomach, your intestines, your kidneys, spleen, pancreas, etc. Again, you don't have much voluntary or conscious control over them. The glands are all the parts of your endocrine system which make and secrete and respond to various hormones which can circulate throughout your body. So the autonomic branch of the peripheral nervous system is the part of the peripheral nervous system, or the portion of the peripheral nervous system that transmit signals from the central nervous system out into the periphery of your body to the parts of your body which you don't have a lot of conscious control over. So we've broken down the central nervous system we've broken down the nervous system into central and peripheral. We've broken down peripheral into somatic and autonomic. Now we're going to break down autonomic into the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system and the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. Now, the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system is all the parts of the autonomic nervous system in the periphery which transmit signals to the smooth muscles, to the glands, to the organs of the body in such a way as to activate or arouse them, to get the body ready for action, ready for movement. So if you hear a sudden unexpected noise and your heart jumps and your muscles tense, that is very literally activity within the periphery of your nervous system carried out by the autonomic branch of the peripheral nervous system, specifically the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. Balanced against that is the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. This is the part of the autonomic nervous system that works, generally speaking, in opposite, to deactivate or calm down the body, get the body back to a resting state. So in my example, you heard that unexpected noise, your heart jumped, or seemed to jump, of course, your muscles tensed, but a few seconds later you realize it was just like a car backfiring or someone dropping something outside in the hallway outside of your room. You realize it wasn't really a threat, and almost immediately your body calms back down. You don't stay in that state of arousal or activity for a very long period of time. At least hopefully you don't. That calming down process that you experience quite naturally is the activity of the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system in the periphery, the peripheral nervous system. So again, if you've taken a good anatomy class, you may be familiar with rather technical diagrams of the specific nerves in this case, the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, and in the next slide I'll show you the parasympathetic branch. For the purposes of our class here, you don't need to memorize any really of these nerves. I'm just trying to highlight, in a kind of a schematic sense, where they are, how they branch off of different parts of your spinal cord. And you can see here on the the right portion of this image various organs that are connected to or innervated by the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. And here's the parasympathetic branch, and so different nerves connecting to some of the same organs, and you can get a sense that you have some nerves which are passing signals along to the heart, say, which are telling the heart to activate, and you've got some signals that are passing, or some nerves that are passing signals along to the heart, and you can imagine to tell it to deactivate or to slow down. The important idea to recognize here is that the sympathetic branch and the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system kind of work in balance with each other. You have, for a given organ system like the heart and the rest of the cardiac system, or the stomach and the rest of the digestive system, multiple nerves coming from the sympathetic branch and the parasympathetic branch, generally speaking, exerting a kind of a balancing act on the activities of those systems. So the extent to which your heart is speeding up versus slowing down, the extent to which your stomach is activating and secreting gastric juices, or deactivating and becoming more relaxed, will be a function of the relative balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic. Depending on what's going on overall in your body, or what's going on in the world around you that your body is responding to, it might be the case that from any moment to moment the sympathetic branch is kind of more in the lead, or the parasympathetic branch is more in the lead. But as a metaphor, we really think about them balancing each other out, minute to minute, hour to hour, day to day, across, well, your whole life. You get a little sense of this balancing act in this picture here. Again, this is obviously kind of cartoony and schematic. It's just designed to highlight some parts of the body, some organ systems, pardon me, goodness, some parts of the body, some organ systems. You can see how the parasympathetic and sympathetic branches act on these systems in sort of opposite ways. So for instance, when the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system in the periphery is kind of holding sway, your pupils will dilate. Your body, your nervous system is trying to absorb more information. Maybe you're under some sort of state of threat, and your eyes dilate so you can gather as much information as possible visually from the world around you. When you're more relaxed, the parasympathetic branch holds sway and your pupils constrict. When the sympathetic branch is holds sway, your saliva from your salivary glands in your mouth is inhibited. You don't produce as much spit. If you've ever been in a fight or in a scary situation, you may have noticed your mouth feeling very dry. Well, that's literally because you're not producing the normal amount of spit or saliva that you produce minute to minute, because at that moment you don't really need to eat anything, because maybe you're scared, or there's something really important you have to pay attention to, so you don't need that activity. Balanced against that, when the parasympathetic branch holds sway, your mouth, the salivary glands in your mouth are producing more saliva, and that's probably because when you're relaxing you might be eating something or drinking something. I mentioned the heart already. Sympathetic branch accelerates the heart, parasympathetic decelerates the heart. The lungs and the cardiovascular system. Sympathetic branch relaxes the bronchi, so you can take big deep breaths, get a lot of air in, get a lot of oxygen in. Parasympathetic branch constricts the bronchi. You don't need to take big deep breaths, and so on and so on. You can see in this picture many examples of this kind of balancing act back and forth. Now, I've kind of hinted at this already, but we often associate activity of the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system with the so-called fight or flight response. And that makes sense, because things like increased heart rate, increased muscle tone, decreased digestive activity are useful now to us, and have been in the past for animals, including humans, throughout evolutionary history, in situations that involve fighting or fleeing from potential threats. So again, if you're a human or any other animal and you're about to get into a fight, you're under threat of attack, it makes sense to increase your heart rate because your heart can pump more blood, get more oxygen to the muscles, get rid of lactic acid and other metabolic byproducts from the muscles more efficiently. Your muscles get tense so you can punch or scramble up a rock or flee or fight or whatever. Your digestive activity decreases because you don't at that very moment need to digest your food. You don't need to waste any resources of the body in terms of its blood flow to kind of working on that meal. Interestingly, why people sometimes feel sickened to their stomach during or immediately after a scary situation is because their gut, their stomach, and other parts of their digestive system kind of go offline at least a little bit, and you may even throw up if you're very scared, or if you're really scared, your urinary system, your excretory system, particularly your bladder, might relax. You might pee or defecate. Animals when they're scared will defecate because under threat. When the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system holds sway, the bladder relaxes, the rectum relaxes, and in humans, of course, that's embarrassing maybe, but in animals that's helpful because at that moment you don't need to worry about holding on to pee or feces if you're being attacked by a predator, or you need to run away from something very threatening. So fight or flight system or fight or flight response is associated with the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. Balanced against that, the activity of the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system is sometimes characterized as the rest and digest response, or the rest and recover response. You could imagine, an animal, whether it's a human or another animal, has had to chase down prey, capture and kill something to eat. During the course of that chase, the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system holds sway, and there's increased heart rate, increased muscle tone, decreased digestion, etc., etc. But then that animal captures and kills its prey. Now it needs to relax, and it needs to be able to eat and digest food for that calorie source. And so decreased heart rate, decreased muscle tone, etc., 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 increased digestive activity, and so on, to allow the body to, as efficiently as possible, rest, digest, maybe recover from stress or injury, and so on. Now, I've mentioned this already, but kind of an important idea here that I want to focus on a little bit is that our nervous system generally, and for the purpose of today's lecture, specifically our peripheral nervous system, and more specifically the parasympathetic and sympathetic branches of the autonomic branch of the peripheral nervous system, these systems of nervous tissue are shaped by evolution. We believe, and biology has good evidence to suggest that, like other parts of our body, this is the product of evolution over many millions of years, shaped by the forces of natural selection. We have a nervous system, an autonomic branch of our peripheral nervous system that we have because it helps animals like us, or it has helped in the past animals like us, to survive. We've been able to get away from danger, to capture food, to mate with our other members of our species and reproduce offspring because in part of the activity of these systems. An interesting idea that connects with this, or an important idea that connects with this, that we're really going to focus on a lot throughout this semester, is that drugs influence the nervous system in part by increasing or decreasing activity of various subsystems. In this case, the sympathetic or parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. So part of the reason why cocaine feels the way it does, or nicotine feels the way it does, or alcohol feels the way it does to the user subjectively, is how those drugs are influencing his or her autonomic nervous system out in the periphery. There are other effects as well in the central nervous system. Those can be really important, but it's important to recognize that there are activities or effects in the peripheral nervous system. And again, drugs can influence these systems because these systems are designed to either arouse us or sedate us, to speed us up or slow us down. Well, that's a lot of what some drugs do to us. They speed us up or slow us down. to kind of further continue here with an interesting idea, it's worth reflecting on that evolution, or what's sometimes called the environment of evolutionary adaptation, that is, how evolutionary biologists describe what the world was like throughout most of the course of evolutionary history, that world didn't include drugs. So nowadays, when humans take drugs, we're giving our nervous system substances which, in a sense, we have very little evolutionary preparation for. So the fact that our body can become aroused in the presence of a threat is adaptive. It's something that evolution has given us that is very helpful. The fact that cocaine can arouse us in a similar fashion is because cocaine, in a sense, is taking the place of, or sometimes the metaphor we use is hijacking an existing adapted bodily system. And it's interesting to note that because we don't have preparation for drugs in terms of our evolution, the reactions that we have to drugs are often quite extreme. They can be much stronger, or you can have a much stronger arousal from cocaine than you might have from having an orgasm, or from facing up to a foe in a fight. You can have a much stronger reaction from heroin than you might have from a relaxing nap that you would take when you're in a comfortable, safe environment. Why are the effects of drugs so strong, at least some drugs? It's because our body isn't really ready for them, so to speak, because our body is like the bodies of our ancestors, and those bodies didn't evolve in environments that had drugs. Now, if you're if you're kind of a skeptical thinker or a careful thinker, at this very moment you might be wondering, wait a sec, doesn't the environment include drugs? There certainly are some drugs which come from natural sources, whether they are plants or fungi, and might it not be the case that throughout evolutionary history, in the so-called environment of evolutionary adaptation, there were things like psychedelic mushrooms, or opium poppies, or coca leaves, or cacao chocolate beans that contain caffeine, and so on and so on. And the answer is yes. The environment does contain many natural substances, plants and fungi especially, that contain psychoactive compounds. Those very compounds which are some of the drugs which people use and abuse. We'll talk about that a lot in future lectures. However, it's important to keep in mind two things. One thing is that while it is true that some animals, including humans of course, consume these drug sources, these plants and fungi, and they have done so, we think, probably throughout evolutionary history, for the most part they do so for calorie sources. So there are plenty of animals, including humans, but plenty of non-human animals which will consume rotten fruit. Every so often, if you pay attention to the news or kind of surf around websites that feature weird news stories, you'll hear news stories often from countries which have very tropical climates about like monkeys or sometimes elephants or wild pigs eating rotten fruit and then kind of running all around drunk and getting into trouble and hurting themselves and hurting humans. These are interesting news stories, and they show that animals will seek out, sometimes preferentially seek out, things like rotten fruit, which contains alcohol and which can make you drunk, in part because alcohol is a good calorie source. It's a very relatively cheap and easy way to get calories into your body. Indeed, throughout a lot of human history, not just human evolution, but recorded human history, people have brewed beer or fermented wine or fermented apple cider because it tasted good, and they probably liked feeling a bit drunk, but also it provided valuable calories. So there are some examples of animals and humans throughout history, and probably throughout evolutionary history, using drug sources in the natural environment, but for the most part these were probably mostly for calorie sources, not for getting high, at least not in the way that humans nowadays imagine getting high or getting stoned. Also, it's almost certainly the case that we haven't had in the past access to, or easy access to, purified, concentrated versions of drugs. So nowadays, if you want, you can find drugs like cocaine, and cocaine is extracted from coca leaves, as I'll discuss in a future lecture, and it's a very powerful stimulant which you can get in relatively purified form. Throughout a lot of human history, people who live in Central and South America have chewed coca leaves, the source of cocaine, and as they've done so, they've achieved kind of a stimulated feeling, like having a couple strong cups of coffee. But that's nowhere near as strong as the effect that you could get from doing a line of cocaine. Similarly, animals, including humans, have consumed rotten fruit and probably gotten a little bit drunk off of it throughout history, but distilled alcohol, liquor, is a relatively recent invention, dating back only maybe at tops 1,000 years, if that even. So not long enough to really count as much of any time in terms of evolutionary history. Other drugs like marijuana, for instance, grows naturally, has probably for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, but highly selected and carefully cultivated marijuana, which produces very high levels of the cannabinoid compounds which make you feel high or stoned. That's something that doesn't exist except inside of the laboratories and grow operations of humans nowadays. That's not something that existed even 100 years ago, let alone many thousands or even millions of years ago. So nowadays we have drugs, at least we have access to drugs, which are much, much, much more concentrated and powerful than anything like what we as humans and as animals have ever grown up with, so to speak, in terms of our evolution. So just to repeat that idea, the nervous system, in a sense, is unprepared for drugs. It isn't prepared by its own evolution for drugs, and thus the responses that we see to many drugs are often much stronger than the responses that we would see to natural stimuli, which might activate our peripheral nervous system or our central nervous system. So things like food or safety or sex, or even consuming some natural sources of drugs like rotten fruit or chewing a coca leaf. The reactions that those stimuli and those activities give us are relatively mild in comparison to the reactions that your body has when you inject heroin or consume a lot of alcohol or do a line of cocaine, and so on and so on. So hopefully that's clear. It was a bit of a digression there. I want to kind of bring it back to the peripheral nervous system for the last few slides of this lecture. Hopefully that'll make sense. So in terms of the activity of the peripheral nervous system, especially the parasympathetic and sympathetic branches of the autonomic nervous system within the peripheral nervous system, we can often make a very basic distinction between classes of drugs which tend to act mostly on the sympathetic branch and drugs which act mostly on the parasympathetic branch. So drugs which tend to increase activity in the parasympathetic branch or decrease activity in the sympathetic branch, these are drugs which, generally speaking, slow you down. So drugs which are sedatives or depressants or hypnotics, like to some extent alcohol, quaaludes, ketamine. There are a number of drugs which, generally speaking, will slow you down, make you feel drowsy or sleepy, or even render you unconscious. These are drugs which, among their other effects in the central nervous system, out in the peripheral nervous system, tend to be tilting the balance towards parasympathetic activity, slowing down versus speeding up. In contrast, drugs which tilt the balance towards the sympathetic branch, increasing activity of the sympathetic branch, decreasing activity of the parasympathetic branch, these are drugs which we classify as stimulants. So caffeine, cocaine, amphetamines in their various forms, these are all drugs which, among their other effects in the central nervous system, out in the periphery, will tend to have that characteristic sympathetic response. They'll tend to increase heart rate, decrease salivation, decrease digestive activity, dilate pupils, etc., etc. We group them, or we can group them, as stimulants, and we can characterize the effect they have in the periphery as primarily a sympathetic effect, or a sympathetic activation versus parasympathetic. So here's something to practice or to think about. Imagine the last time you had some caffeine. If you're like me, you had caffeine in the morning in the form of coffee or tea. You might be drinking some caffeinated beverage right now. If you have the opportunity, go fix yourself, a cup of coffee, or open up a Diet Coke, or whatever it is that you enjoy for your caffeine. Then, as you're consuming it in the next few minutes and maybe the remainder of this hour, try to notice the effects that this drug is having on your body. Or if you can't drink a cup of coffee right now, think back to the last cup of coffee you had and try and remember what it felt like as you were using the drug and for the next 20 to 40 to 60 minutes afterwards. What was going on in the peripheral nervous system, in the sympathetic branch and the parasympathetic branch? Did you have any sense of your heart rate increasing? Did you have any sense of your stomach feeling more kind of acidic or kind of irritated? For instance, if you drink a lot of coffee, at least if I drink a lot of coffee, it tends to make my stomach feel kind of irritated and acidy, like I've got a bit of acid reflux or indigestion. Did it make you feel a bit sweaty? Did it make your muscles feel a bit tense, or did you notice yourself at all jittery? Clearly, most or probably all people have had experience with caffeine, so I'm not asking you to reflect on something that is all that weird or unusual, but what I am asking you to do, if you haven't done this recently, is try and use your powers of reflection and attention to notice, if you can, effects of a drug in your body, and try and use those experiences to help you learn about the stuff that I've just covered in this lecture. The autonomic branch of the peripheral nervous system, specifically its sympathetic and parasympathetic components. So throughout this lecture, I've been breaking things down into smaller and smaller levels, or subsystems and subsystems of subsystems. If you're getting a little confused, that's okay. It takes a bit to kind of get this all online. Here's a nice graphic which describes the breakdown from the nervous system to the peripheral and central. I'll get to the central nervous system in the next lecture, but within the peripheral nervous system, the somatic and autonomic, we focused mostly on the autonomic, and within the autonomic, we've really tried to characterize the distinction between sympathetic and parasympathetic. So if that's clear, great. If it isn't, sit there for a few minutes, take a look at this picture, think about it, and hopefully it will make sense to you. Important ideas to finish up with are just that the nervous system is complicated. Like I said, many textbooks in biology or anatomy and physiology will point out that the nervous system is the most complicated thing in the universe. I suppose so. It certainly is incredibly complicated, but for the purpose of organization and for the purpose of learning, it's often valuable to break it down into systems and subsystems, and that's more or less what I've been trying to do in this lecture. It's also important to connect the idea that the drug experience is based partly on how drugs affect, in this case, the peripheral nervous system. So especially whether a drug activates the sympathetic or parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system in the peripheral nervous system, that tone, whether it's more sympathetic or more parasympathetic, will influence how the drug feels to the user, whether he or she feels revved up and activated or calmed and sedated by the drug can be described in part as a function of the effects that that drug has in the periphery. Alright, so here's a preview for next time. As I've already said, we're going to focus on the central nervous system, and I'm going to take kind of a systems level approach, identifying some major parts and systems within the central nervous system, mostly within the brain. In the next lecture after that, I'll talk a little bit on a more kind of cellular and molecular level, what's going on in the nervous system. So we've got a few more interesting lectures up next. But before we get there, I just want to say thanks for your attention. If you have a few minutes or even longer to relax and think about what you've learned, please do so. I always find that I learn things better if I can take some breaks and allow the material to sink in. Maybe engage in some other activity to distract myself a little, play some music, take a walk, and hopefully this stuff that I've covered will make sense to you and you will stick in your brain and you'll remember it. Okay, again, thanks so much for your attention. I'll see you, or you'll hear me, I suppose, in the next lecture. Bye-bye.